Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the webinar. We hope that you had a great lunch and everything is going well at your local sites. We have two webinar presentations this afternoon. The first one is on assessing enterprise feasibility. I'm Colette D. Phelps, and I'll be giving the first part of the presentation. And then we'll turn it over to Jessica McAleese, who's in Driggs today. So I wanted to start by introducing two concepts that come from Joel Salatin. Many of you might be familiar with this book, You Can Farm, The Entrepreneur's Guide to Start and Succeed in a Farming Enterprise. This is a landmark book in terms of sustainable agriculture and local food systems, and it was written in 1988. Joel Salatin introduced this concept of a centerpiece enterprise, and that's an enterprise that's a mainstay of your farm. At the time he introduced this concept, his mainstay or his centerpiece enterprise was pastured poultry. So some of the criteria for a centerpiece enterprise is that it would have low initial startup costs relative to the ability to generate income. And a number of our speakers have already talked about this morning, that you're looking for an enterprise that's not going to take a lot of capital to get up and going. You also want it to have a high gross profit margin. And if you're unfamiliar with gross profit margin, that's when you're looking at your revenues from your enterprise and your direct costs for that enterprise. So your direct costs are associated with that enterprise in particular, and you want to have a high gross profit margin. So when you subtract your costs from your income from that enterprise, you actually have quite a bit of income. You can look at that if you subtract costs from your income and then you divide it by your gross profit, you should get a margin, and you want that margin to be about 25 to 35%. And one of the reasons you want that to happen is that you want it to be making enough money to actually pay for some of your indirect costs. So, and your indirect costs might be your mortgage on your land. They might be how you allocate some of your electricity or some of your general inputs that are not necessarily specific to that one enterprise. And we'll be talking more about looking at the costs of your enterprises as we move through this course. You want to also have really low maintenance requirements, or if there is a lot of maintenance, that's something that you're going to want to know how to do yourself. So, you don't want to be putting a lot of money into something that you're going to have to hire someone to do. Looking at high cash flow, that you have a quick turnaround. So in a centerpiece enterprise, if you are thinking about your orchard being your centerpiece enterprise, and that's not going to have a quick cash flow turnaround. You're going to need to be thinking really long term. So Salatin is saying, think about something that you can start with that's going to start to generate income quickly. And you might want to look at the success rate overall. In his book, Salatin talks a lot about those kind of enterprises that are fads, maybe like Emu. And so if you weren't on the ground floor of Emu, you ended up getting into enterprise that potentially cost you a lot of money in the end because it was already part of a fad. He said you have to be in front of fads. So you want to look at some things that have high demand, and it might have low supply, or it might just have a demand that is not being met. You also want to have a product that's relatively size neutral, which means when you have a smaller enterprise, your profit margins don't decrease. Complementary enterprises are ones that use your existing infrastructure, and they fill in with cash flow and work in times that your centerpiece enterprise is not generating income. So for instance, you may have decided that you want your centerpiece enterprise to be raising tomatoes for the wholesale market. And you know that your tomatoes are going to be ripe in August and September. That's when most of your cash flow is going to come. So you need to look at some type of income that, an enterprise that you can generate income outside of that peak time with the tomatoes. So you might decide that you're going to be selling tomato starch. You're developing those for yourself, for your main centerprise enterpiece, so you plant more, so at the beginning of the season, you're able to market those starts. So you're really looking at evenly distributing your cash flow. You also want to increase your customer flow. So you want to be able to use your complementary enterprises to increase your customer base and draw them to your centerpiece enterprise. And many farming operations consider more than one complementary enterprise. And we definitely heard that today when Melissa was talking about the different products that she has or enterprises in her farm. So in 1988, this is what Salatin identified as the best enterprises. So for centerpiece enterprises, he's looking at pastured broilers because it was relatively inexpensive to put those together. And also he looked at eggs as a possibility. He also has a book called Salad Bar Beef, which is looking at rotational grazing and raising beef, very similar to the 1 year, not quite 1 year cycle that Melissa mentioned, grass-based dairy, market gardening, and the list goes on. And then he looked at the complementary enterprises that he felt existed in 1988. So one of the things that you're going to want to do is when you think about your centerpiece enterprises and your complementary enterprises is to really look at what you have passion for. If you don't have passion for it, then it's going to be really hard to get up and do it every day. And, some days it's not going to be nice outside, or it's going to be way too hot and you still need to get out there and do it. Also, you want to talk to your family members or the partners in your operation, even if they aren't directly involved in the production system, they're part of your landscape in terms of your home landscape. And what you do is going to affect each other. So you really want to talk about it and make sure that everybody is on board and understands their roles. And if you're going to ask them to fill in and it's not their passion, that you really know that they have your back and that they're okay with that. Researching is critical. There's a lot of different issues surrounded all kinds of enterprises. You want to look at the different legal issues, and that might be zoning. It might also be what are the rules for on-farm processing if you're doing broilers. You're going to need to look both at your local level and your state level, and sometimes you're going to fall under federal rules as well. When we talk about funding, we're also talking about cash flow. How much money are you going to need to get started, and how much money are you going to need at different times throughout the season? You're also going to want to look at what your time requirements are for production and for marketing. And so if you decide that you want to market through, let's say, a farmer's market, you really need to value the time that it's going to take you to prepare and move that product to market, and really look at that in terms of the overall profitability of that particular enterprise. And again, you want to look at the history of what's worked in your area, what some of the current trends are, and what are some of the future prospects. And some of the ways that you can really do this is getting out there and looking at some of the popular literature about what people are talking about in different types of magazines that are covering farming or specific agricultural products or trends that people are interested in. This book, Farming Alternatives, is going to be one of the core texts of this course. And unfortunately, we did not have that available for you today, but it will be mailed directly to you, and it should arrive next Thursday on the 18th. This entire text is really helping you evaluate new farm-based enterprises. Chapter 4 is going to focus on production information about your crop or livestock enterprise, Chapter 3 about marketing, and there's also a lot of information around income and expenses. You're really going to want to go out and find a lot of information about what you want to grow in particular and what are the optimal conditions for producing that item. So as Lauren mentioned, looking at the climate, soil, water, as Jen mentioned, looking at your infrastructure, equipment needs, fencing, facilities. There's two kinds of information that we talk about when we talk about enterprise assessment. One is secondary data, and secondary data is research that's already been collected. And so you might be able to find some information about how many people live in your county. And of those people, how many eat broccoli? And what's the potential demand for your product based on factors like that? Secondary data is often not extremely specific to your location, so it gives you some information, but you really need to get out there and gather primary data, which is what you get by phoning people, visiting, surveying your community. It's your data gathering in a personal way about your particular situation. And it's also really important to get to know and develop farmer or mentoring relationships with farmers so that you have a cohort of experienced farmers that you can call on and ask questions of, and bounce your ideas off of them, and they might help you think about some things that you haven't thought about before in terms of market potential, products that might fit your system, or lessons learned about why not to do something. In addition to the Farming Alternatives resource, which we really want you to read and complete the exercises within, on the website for this course, there's going to be a whole host of other resources that you can look at in terms of identifying what potential crop and livestock enterprises there are for your particular situation. And at lunch, you also talked about some of the resource people in your community going to Extension, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, small business development centers, organizations like Rural Roots, and other local nonprofit groups. All of them have conversations, reach out, see what they're seeing in terms of your market trends and opportunities. This particular table is in one of the publications on the last slide, Keys to Successfully Choosing Enterprises That Suit Your Small Farm. And I want to make a suggestion that maybe you want to put together a similar table where you would do some evaluation of the type of resources, whether that is startup capital or management skills, operating costs, that you need in terms of the different enterprises that you're exploring, and to get a snapshot on what the different costs in terms of those different considerations would be. And finally, I just wanted to recap by saying it's super important that you do your research. That's what this class is all about, doing research and connecting with farmers in your area with a variety of different sources. To also go to different workshops, conferences, farm tours, and field days, even if they're not related to the specific enterprise that you're interested in. That's a great way to meet resource people, to get to know other farmers. And within those conversations, you're going to start thinking about different questions that you can ask, and you're going to learn a lot. So if you're not thinking about doing livestock, but there is a field day that's looking at pasture management, it would be good for you to consider going and getting that experience, being part of those conversations. And then you really need to ask yourself, what's true for your situation, for your area and your potential market? Because you'll get a lot of ideas, but again, you have to come back and ground truth them to what works for you, your family, your farm partner, the amount of resources that you have, and your market. With that, I'm going to switch and move on to Jessica, and she'll talk about what they've done with their farm and assessing the feasibility of enterprises from a farmer's perspective.
Today I wanted to talk about the importance of evaluating our enterprises before we actually start down those paths. And on our farm, you know, there's three important pieces to our puzzle. And I can say this for every single person that I'd ever give advice to, is to dream big, start smart, and keep really good records. Seriously, write that down again. Bold it, underline it 3 times, put a circle around it, put it on a sticky note, stick it to your forehead. Please keep good records because not only will it be beneficial to your long-term farm journey, but we get short-term memory loss as farmers, and we cannot remember what worked and what didn't work day to day, year to year. Everything kind of blurs together. And then the last thing is, when you are trying to change your enterprises or looking for funding, wanting to go to an investor or to a bank or to a loan operator, you need to show that you have a viable business and that you know what you're doing. So even if it's keeping a journal, that's a good place to start. So I can't emphasize that enough. It took us 8 years of leasing other people's land before we finally found our piece of ground that would meet our farm dream. And even then, it was just a bare piece of ground. We really couldn't find anything with the infrastructure that we needed to make our farm dream happen. And so we had to make some compromises, but we started smart. We started with what we could afford, and we put the pieces of the puzzle together. And because we kept good records for those previous 8 years, we were able to make a little bit of magic happen so that we could continue our farm journey. Next slide. We've talked a lot about resource inventory, and it's been suggested that you do this as part of this class. And I'm going to be even more insistent and not suggest it, but tell you, please do this. Go home and do it. Write down these ideas about your enterprises that you're thinking of. You have to identify what you have available to you right now to make your farm enterprise happen. And then also identify what's missing. What are those puzzle pieces that are missing so that you can go out and get those pieces. Nobody is going to do it for you. You have to do it. And every farm is so different. Physical resources, marketing resources, management and labor, byproduct resources, and those financial resources. So you all have this information in your notebook, and we've talked about it today. So start making lists, because you will need those lists in order to make your next step. Next slide. Please, next slide. Oh, thank you. What I know about happens to be vegetables. We don't do livestock on our farm yet. And because number one, I love veggies. I love growing plants. I love seeing things grow. But also, if we integrated livestock onto our farm right now, we would be doing the work, and that's pretty much full season, full year work year round for us. And we want to take a little bit of a break in the winter months. And so we just do veggies for now until we can maybe partner with some other folks. And so what I can tell you about vegetables is on the next slide, and going through all those different resources that I just mentioned. So under physical resources, when we started looking about what we wanted to do with vegetables on our farm, everybody points us towards looking at the USDA hardiness zones, you know, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5. And that's helpful. I don't want to diss it too much, but with the changing climate, with the different microclimates in every single part of this world, you really have to take it with a grain of salt. You can get some very good general ideas of which zone you are in, but I'm guaranteeing you that if you live in Idaho, that your little microclimate part of the world is going to be different than your neighbors, than the person down the street, than that zone hardiness map. So when you identify a piece of ground, or maybe you're already on a piece of ground, start making notes and paying attention to the daily temperatures, the daily weather, where the wind is coming from, what those little microclimates are doing on a regional level, a local level, a micro level, and pay attention. What are your soils like? We've talked a lot about soils in our class here in Driggs, but everything is just a little bit different. Water availability and equipment and tools needed. The marketing resources, when we look at vegetable production, we look at what our demographics are like. And in Salmon, Idaho in particular, we have a very, very isolated community. It's 2.5 hours away from any town, generally speaking. If you include Chalice, which is even smaller than Salmon, that's an hour away. But it's 2.5 hours to Missoula and 2.5 hours to Idaho Falls. And so we really market all of our crops quite locally and can make a go of it, but we've really had to do a lot of research of why that can work that way. We do farmers market, farm stand, and all sorts of other methods. But start looking at what your region looks like if you want to do vegetables or anything else, and start looking at those demographics and constantly evaluate them. We're constantly looking at who's interested in our vegetables and actually who's buying our vegetables, because sometimes that's not necessarily the same, and then making those adjustments as needed. Management and labor, what needs to be done, obviously, and who the heck is going to do it. If I had to rely on Jeremy to do the Facebook page and send out the CSA newsletter and manage the website and do all the square business for the running the credit card, we wouldn't, it's not his passion. I like marketing, and so I have taken on that role. He's really good with Fergie, the tractor, and you know, planning things in straight lines. So that's his niche. But identify who is going to do all of this work. And we're getting to the point where physically we would like some help with all this work. And so this is the first year we're really in the position to take on some long-term internships and some farm volunteers. So we're going to explore some help for that season. And I'm very, very excited about it. Byproduct resources, I actually really like how Joel Salatin puts it as a complementary enterprise, because I feel like a lot of our byproduct resources, those things that are left over from our enterprise, can actually be put into use. And so on our farm, you know, we're thinking about seed production as our next enterprise. We would always love to do some value-added products, but we're just don't have enough clones ourselves yet to do that. And then in terms of veggie production, you know, we have it to the point where our planning, we don't really have a lot of leftovers, but we do occasionally have veggie leftover at the end of the week from post-harvest. And so we have some good outlets of what to do with all those veggies. But that's a reality that you have to kind of grapple with. And financial resources, I'd like to talk a little bit about this, because I am like many of our farmers who've spoken today who did not want to go into debt, who find a lot of freedom in being debt-free. And we've always been of that mindset. However, having gone into debt now, buying land and doing some major infrastructure on the farm, including trying to build a straw bale house, I've realized that a little debt can actually go a very long way. And I just want to caution you, I'm not giving you a free pass to go and load up the credit card, but if you spend a little money and are smart about it and start small, you can make some really good financial decisions for your business. And it's okay to go into a little bit of debt to make your farm business happen. Next slide, please. One of our complementary enterprises is herbs, our herbs. We do culinary and medicinal herbs, but this is one of the enterprises you can think about if you're looking at vegetable production on the farm. And I just want to caution that although many herbs are perennial, that just being perennial, that it comes back year after year, does not mean that they are less work. So make a note that if you plant perennial plants, you still will have a lot of work ahead of you. But it is really, really fun to incorporate herbs into your enterprise development. There's a huge market for herbal products, and under the cottage food law in Idaho, you can really have a very great blossoming enterprise for pretty low overhead by incorporating herbs into your business. Next slide. Small fruit and nut trees are a wonderful way to incorporate either a U-pick operation or agritourism into your business. Do take note that unless you move into an area with an established orchard, for example, that it will take several years for this enterprise to come online. But if you're planning ahead, which all of you are, so give yourselves a pat on the back, this can come online for you in a few years from now, if you're smart about it. U-pick operations with small berry production, I feel like are just a fabulous way to engage customers because people are constantly looking for fresh fruit. However, with most of the fruit production, you need to realize that there's some infrastructure costs like cold storage. Many fruits have pretty high perishability and do not last very long at market and bruise easily. And so keep all those factors in mind if you're thinking about incorporating small fruits or nut trees into your operation. Next slide. Oh, this is one of my favorites because I love flowers. I wouldn't grow vegetables if I couldn't grow flowers. Don't do a very lot with my flowers that I grow because it takes a lot of time to put together bouquets. They don't transport very well. They transport to market, which for us is 2 miles away, and they keep all day just fine, but there's no way I could ship them anywhere. A lot of the cut flower operations that are very, very successful in our state have it dialed in, and they use cold storage, they use refrigerated trucks, they have everything kind of outlined. But it's a fun business to start to go into, and I feel like there's a lot of partnerships available for people who want to partner with local florists or do weddings or other special events on their farm. And it keeps coming up for our farm. I keep trying not to do bouquets at farmers markets because it takes so much time, but people keep asking for them. And so I keep doing them, and I finally found a young lady in Salmon who is just finishing up high school, and she wants to someday start a cut flower business. And so I'm trying to get her to be a specific intern this summer just to do the cut flowers. Next slide. We don't do any really traditional grain on our farm necessarily, but it's a really untapped market, I think, in Idaho for small scale grain production, especially with some of those specialty grains that people are really interested in now, like quinoa and spelt and a few other ones. The one thing that we do grow, I just keep growing and experimenting with, is black Kabuli garbanzo beans. And Jeremy keeps rolling his eyes because I keep growing them out. I never do anything with them. They do great, but it's one of those things where I like to experiment, but this is not an enterprise for me. But if you do, you really have to look at what sort of infrastructure is available regionally to help you market those grains. Specifically, is there a mill nearby? Because selling just wholesale grain may not be viable, but if you can process that grain into a usable form, like flour or some sort of cereal ready to eat, then that would be a viable option. Next slide, please. Many of you have a little bit larger pieces of ground to work with and might have the ability to do hay crops or pasture. You can lease land to other people for pasture. And I just wanted to highlight that because we have 10 acres, but we only have about 2.5 in cultivation of vegetables. So we're left over with all this pasture that we really don't know what we're going to do with yet. And so we're kind of exploring this as another enterprise for our farm. The one problem with hay production is that most hay equipment now is big scale, like the big round 1-ton bales. And so it's getting harder and harder for people to find small scale baling equipment. And but that might be an enterprise somebody is willing to go into, is that small scale haying equipment, because homeowners and people who are moving into the state who have horses need those small bales or desire those small bales. So that's kind of an untapped niche that I am seeing, at least in our part of the state. Next slide, please. Other potential enterprises, depending on what part of the state you live in, you know, mushrooms, seedlings and bedding plants, beer, hops, honey, garlic, specialty crops. If you live up north, you're lucky that you're surrounded by woods and trees. But all of these resources that are on our farms, we can really cultivate them into some successful enterprises for ourselves. But the main point is that whatever big ideas you have, let's start exploring what it's going to take to make those happen. And I think on the next slide, I reiterate, oh, no, yeah, I'll get to my points here in a second. But I did want to just go over our cornerstone enterprise, which is our CSA, which is Community Supported Agriculture. And so I view our CSA as an enterprise on the farm. And I just kind of went through very briefly and talked about some of that resource inventory when it comes specifically to our CSA. So under physical resources that we'll need to look at, the climate, soil, and water. With a CSA, you need to realize you have many, many different crops. Multiple crops needs multiple needs, and you're going to have to look at all the different soils and climate needs of all of those crops and water needs. And in addition, I throw equipment and cold storage under there as well to help keep all of those different crops that we harvest good until we bring it to our market. Demographics of your market, of course, but also with a CSA, you need to look at attrition rates. So that means who's signing up in the spring and who's a new member every year and how many members are you losing every year. And one of the biggest factors impacting a CSA is that people get too many vegetables each week and they feel like they're wasting veggies. And so they don't return to the CSA because of that. Management and labor, I think you can imagine how much it takes to run a CSA, but you have a lot of coordinating, planting, planning, weeding, harvesting, deliveries. There's a lot that goes into it. So keep that in mind, and who's going to do all that work. And byproduct and financial, you can see that you do have some excess production. Where is that going to go? And how much do you have on hand to make this happen? Next slide. So here are my 3 points that I just wanted to reiterate. Please do your homework, or not calling it homework, please do your activities, because it's really, really important for you to be successful. I love dreaming big. I wouldn't do this if I didn't like to think outside the box and see where we wanted to go. But please start small and start smart, because you will not waste money doing that way. You will not waste your time and your energy if you just start small. And then keep your good records, because I know you're all very good record keepers, and it's going to help you build your business in the future. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. We do have a couple questions, so I'd just like to take a couple minutes for those. We have a question from Sandpoint about a cut flower operation.
Yeah.
Oh,
just a sec. We turned our speakers off, so there was no echo.
just let me know when you're ready.
Okay, we're ready.
Okay, so what kind of regulations are there for a cut flower operation, and do you think it's a good candidate for a centerpiece enterprise?
Well, let me turn off our speakers for a second. So as far as regulations go for in-state cut flower production, I don't believe there's any regulations, but over state lines, there might be some state regs in terms of moving plant material back and forth. But I think it's a wonderful centerpiece enterprise to explore, as long as you do the homework and find out where you're going to be selling those cut flowers, who your market is, and what that is willing to bear. Because there's a wonderful grower down in the Rose Firth area near Blackfoot, and they travel from Blackfoot clear up to Jackson a few times a week to deliver their cut flowers. And they have a refrigerated truck, they have a refrigerated cold storage room, they're on 2 acres, and I believe they're just trying to sell their farm business about a year ago for about, I think it's like $1.5 million. So might not be affordable to buy the business, but it was a very good farm business model for them.
Right, thank you. We did have a comment from Ariel in Caldwell, and she said that if you're selling over $500, you need a nursery license.
Oh, oops. Yes, actually that's correct. If you are selling, and if you're selling bedding plants also, you do need a nursery license. But if you make under $500 a year off of those items, then you are exempt.
Great, thank you. So I think to keep us on time, we won't take any more questions, but we do have them saved in the chat for answering in our Facebook discussion group. And we will break from the webinar to do our on-site activities. So thank you very much, Jessica.
You bet. Thank you.